Okay, good morning, folks. So we went ahead and updated our textbook to the 4th edition, and what we're looking at here is Chapter 18 of the Muroc JavaScript and jQuery 4th edition textbook, and this is working with Ajax. And the reason we moved ahead on this chapter is that this is Chapter 12 where we left off in our old textbook. But I wanted to get the updated information to my class instead of going off kind of the older information. So wanted to jump ahead in the new textbook and work with the updated information. So this is going to be a partial lecture. We're not going to get all the way through the chapter, but there's a lot of new information here to cover that's good enough for one day, good enough to get us working with Ajax and understanding what it is. And so a little bit of a non-traditional lecture, but let's see how this goes. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on these summary pages and just talk about what is being summarized on each one of these pages instead of, kind of going through, trying to read anything off of here. Just kind of keeping it a high-level summary. Okay, let me open up my code editor, get this ready to go. And I'll just open up my chapter 12. This is where I'm going to write my code. Feel free to write your code in chapter 12 as well. Okay, now we're ready to go with our HTML. Let's get into what is Ajax. First, to understand what Ajax is, let's break it down each word. Ajax stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. So that's what Ajax stands for. And let's break down each word. Asynchronous. Asynchronous, if you look up the definition, asynchronous means not concurrently, not at the same time, right? Literally just asynchronous. Asynchronous, two or more events not happening at the same time. Okay, so we're going to find out that Ajax happens not when the page is loaded. So the page is loaded, and right now most of our code, when it runs, it either runs on an event or when the page is loaded. And the asynchronous part of Ajax means that it does not happen at the same time when the page is loaded. So that's the asynchronous part, not at the same time. Well, JavaScript, we all know what that is because we've been writing JavaScript. You can write Ajax inside of jQuery. Okay, and so you can work with Ajax in jQuery. We are going to focus on the vanilla JavaScript Ajax. Okay, so we are not going to be writing the jQuery equivalent of Ajax. We're just going to be working with almost like when we started the JavaScript portion for the first 8 chapters, we just learned what I called vanilla JavaScript, or not what is called vanilla JavaScript. So we're going to be writing Ajax in vanilla JavaScript, not inside of jQuery. XML. Okay, so we know what asynchronous is, not at the same time. We know what JavaScript is. It's a scripting language to make web pages dynamic. It could be jQuery. You can write Ajax in jQuery, but we're not. And XML. So that covers all of our bases. Now, what is XML? XML is a way to transport data. And we haven't really, that definition might be a little strange because we haven't transported data in this class before. So it'll help to look at what XML actually looks like. But here's the process. The process is this. Data ultimately resides, your data, website data, it ultimately resides in a database. Right? So we've never worked with a database, but just suffice to say it's this computer file. Just think of it as a computer file with terabytes of data, tons and tons of data. Right? Ultimately, we have to write a back-end language, right? So we got front-end code and we got back-end code. We're going to have to write some back-end code to extract that information out of a database. So this back-end code, as we've talked about before, that might be C#, that might be PHP, that might be Ruby, that might be Python, right? And ultimately, we work with SQL, Structured Query Language. And that SQL is going to work with the application code. So all of the languages that I listed, that's the application code. And the SQL is it's called a Structured Query Language. The application code calls the SQL. The SQL gets the data out of the database. Okay? So all that just to say, we're going to get a bunch of information out of a database using application code and using SQL. Okay, so now we have a bunch of information out of a database. Maybe a list of users, maybe a bunch of photos. We just have some information. And that information has to be sent from the server to the client. And so this data has to be stored in some sort of format to send across the internet. And that's what XML is. XML is that language that stores information in a format that can be sent from the server down to your client. Okay, so it's a way to store and transport. Maybe I should add the word store and transport. Now, what's important about XML is that it has to be lightweight. And what I mean by lightweight is because it's a format, it's a data format, and you're going to be transporting a lot of data. It can't be too processor intensive. It's got to be fast. It's got to be snappy. It's got to be very efficient. Okay. And so XML the ML is a markup language, just like HTML, hypertext markup language, HTML. XML is also a markup language. And so it looks very much like HTML. So this is what XML looks like, or it could look like, where you have tags that are opening and closing tags with data in between, right? And so these tags can be anything. Like I could have my first name tag, middle name tag. You could have an address, like a end. Bet you didn't know my middle name was Andreas. I could have a street tag. Ranking is 4431 Finney Avenue. The point is, these tags hold and store our data that's going to go from the back end database to the front end, which is the web browser. Now, XML, what's funny about Ajax is that XML is the older of the technologies to store and transport data. That's what XML does. XML stores and transports data, but there's a newer technology. And by newer, I also mean industry relevant typo to 2020. So there's a newer, more relevant technology to store and transport data that's not XML. This newer technology is called JSON. Okay, so what's a little bit, I guess, ironic or funny to me is that built into the name of Ajax, they built in this technology XML. And if you look at the older book covered XML. But there's a newer technology. That's why I wanted to cover this newer chapter. This newer chapter covers JSON. And JSON is more industry relevant. This is the direction everything's been going for the past several years. Okay? And JSON is not a markup language. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Okay? And so in this chapter, we're going to focus on JSON, and we're going to see how it can also store and transport data in this JavaScript object notation. Okay, so that's what Ajax stands for. And part of Ajax, we know, is going to be working with data from a database. So understanding what Ajax does is pretty simple. Okay, how Ajax is used on the web is pretty simple. Ajax is used to update a part of the web page without doing an entire web page refresh. Like right now, if you change your source code and you're not viewing it in live browser, like let's just say that you are editing your source code in Notepad and you change your source code in Notepad, you go back to the browser, you have to refresh the page to see an update. And so normally, if your source code changes, you have to then refresh the page, the entire page, to see an update. Okay. In the old days of the web, I'll give you an example. The old Google Maps. The old Google Maps, if you were to zoom in on Google Maps, if you were paying attention, you would zoom in, you'd click the little plus button. The entire page would have to do a refresh for the browser to actually zoom in on the map. So the entire web page would refresh. With Ajax, you don't have to do that. With Ajax, you can click the zoom in button and just the map will refresh. The map itself will zoom in, it'll refresh, but the entire web page doesn't need to refresh. Okay, so that's perceived to the end user to be, faster, right? The entire page doesn't have to refresh. They call it a partial page refresh. So a part of the page can refresh. The whole page doesn't have to refresh. Another example of Ajax is used every time you do a Google search. When you do a Google search, you start typing, and this part of the page, which contains your search results, is updating without the entire browser having to refresh. It's updating based on what you type. And so, when you're looking at a standard, what we've been doing so far, okay? Up until this point, we have not worked with application servers and we have not worked with database servers. We've only worked with our web browsers and our web servers, okay? All it is a web browser is a client, a web server hosts the website, which, for example, we did launch the midterm site on Danny's portfolio. So Danny lied, DLY. So this web server, rankin.edu, iwt.rankin.edu, is the web server, and my laptop here is the client. So what happens is a real simple process. My client went to that web server, iwt.rankin.edu, and it says, hey, I want a web page. And it's an HTTP because everything on the World Wide Web operates on HTTP. That's the protocol, okay? What that means is a request is made on port 80. So a request comes in on port 80 of this web server, and it says, I want whatever website is at this URL, /DLY. And then the web server says, okay, well, here's all of the files. Here's all the HTML. Here's all the CSS. Here's all the JavaScript. And then the web browser renders that page. Now, if this website was a little bit more advanced, we might have some C# involved. Maybe you could buy something, and we might have some SQL involved where we're storing information. And so the application server, that's going to be your programming language, like, again, C#, PHP. We covered these bases in the HTML book. If you go back, we studied about what's the difference between a web server, an application server, and a database server. We called it a 3-tier architecture. Well, Ajax, again, the asynchronous means it happens at a separate time. Okay, the normal HTTP process happens when the page is loaded, whenever the user says, give me a file, by typing in a URL. This Ajax happens outside of that request. So what's nice about Ajax, I chuckled at this because literally these two pictures are the same picture. Okay, Ajax can make a similar request for a partial page refresh, and then the web server can respond with that information that the client can use to update a part of the page. So this all happens in the background. The user doesn't know that it's triggering any sort of event when they start typing in a Google search. What happens is, in the background, when you start typing a new Google search, like here, you start typing HTML5, that triggers an event to go to a web server, a Google server, query a database, for that database to return suggestions to populate your browser with. So Ajax happens in the background of a web page running. So that's what Ajax is. Again, I could think of probably a bunch of different examples. You see it all the time. Ajax is used on any modern website. On Facebook, your friend makes a new post and it just pops up on your feed. You don't have to refresh the page. It just pops up. If you reply to something and then your friend starts replying and then boom, there's the reply, you didn't have to refresh anything. It just pops up. You're checking your email and someone sends you an email. You don't have to refresh the whole page. Your email just pops up. And so a lot of that, you notice here, the end user triggered the Ajax to run by typing in the web browser. But sometimes it's just time. 10 seconds goes by, 5 seconds go by, and the Ajax goes and sees if there's any new information to show on your page. So it can just be a timed event. And we know how to run timers. We've done intervals and timeouts and things like that. So we understand that JavaScript can run on timers. Ajax can run on timers as well. Oh yeah, exactly. If you've been a user on any modern website, you've been seeing the effects of Ajax. So let's go through these bullets. Unlike HTTP requests, Ajax requests update a page with data from a web server without needing to reload the entire web page. Check, we got that. This is known as a partial page refresh. Check, I covered that. When working with Ajax, JavaScript sends a request, processes the response, updates the DOM. That's the technical language for when it says update the DOM. That's updating what the user sees, right? The document object model. Remember, we covered the DOM. Is the model of the HTML document, right? By updating the DOM, you update what the user sees. As a result, the browser doesn't need to reload the entire web page. Check, we got that. To send an Ajax request, JavaScript can use a browser object known as, so we did not cover this. So for Ajax, remember this is the Ajax request. The Ajax request is triggered when the user does something. This Ajax request is triggered when the user does something or by a timer. So to get this Ajax request to start, we're going to work with something called an XML object. Well, guess what? We're not doing XML. We're doing JSON. And so I'm not going to focus on the older technology here. I'm going to focus us on the newer technology. This newer technology is called the Fetch API. Whoops.
Fetch API.
Oh, look at that.
Ajax requests are often made to web services that provide application programming interfaces.
Can you guys hear that? My computer's talking to me.
Yep, we can hear it.
I don't know what I clicked. Must have clicked read out loud from here. Okay. Let's see. Okay. A couple of new terms here. I'm going to go back into my code editor. There is a term called API. All right, and make sure programming interfaces. Okay, so programming. So here's this term. I want to define this term in a language that everyone can understand. Okay. People use this term in API like it's something fancy, and it's really not. This is the code that's available for any given language. So for developers to write, yeah, that's better. So an API is essentially all the available code for a given language. That's all an API is. So if you say I have the Java API, well, all that means is that there's a bunch of Java out there that's available for you to write, and this is kind of like the available code to write for a language. So when you say I have the Java API, all that means is that's, and I like to use the word, a library of code. So this is the library of code for any given language. So if there's the Java API or the Ruby API or JavaScript API or Python API, basically that's just the library of code that's available for you to write to build your app. That's all an API is. It's the code that's available for developers to write for any given language. So this API is written at the application server level. Oh no, that's correct. I mean, Java is a library of code that's stored on the application server. Okay, so if the API is the entire library of code, there's another word in here, web service.
Web services that provide...
Hush up. I misclicked again. So your API is your entire library of code. There's another key word here that I think people think is fancy, and it's really nothing fancy. A web service. Web services are awesome. Okay, web services are really cool. Okay, here's what a web service is. A public method or function on the internet. So you guys are familiar with functions in JavaScript because you've written functions. You know, you say function, you give it a function name. Inside of parentheses, you take some parameters inside the parentheses, and then it's just a block of code. And that block of code can do whatever any block of code can do. Whatever you want this block of code to do, you get to code it. Okay, it can do anything. Literally, it can do anything. So a web service is taking one of those functions and making it open to the internet. It's wide open for people to call that public method. This web service also exists on the application server. So if your API is your entire library of code, a web service is just an available method or function, you use those terms interchangeably, that's available for web developers to call. People who understand JavaScript can call these various web services. We can call these methods that exist on the application server. Well, then guess what? The application server can work with this web service. That web service can then query the database, get data out of the database, and send it back to the web browser. And so Facebook has an API with web services in it. And if we want to work with the information that's publicly accessible on Facebook, now here's the thing. Most things on Facebook aren't publicly accessible, right? Because you have to have a username and password. Okay? But I'll give you an example of where a web service is used on a very regular basis. Okay, the stock market. Okay, the stock market is something that happens, every day. It opens up at a certain time, it closes at a certain time, and there are websites all across the internet where you can plug in a stock ticker, click a button, and then get the current stock information for Apple. Like what price is Apple's stock at? And it'll tell you all this information. Is it up? Is it down? What's its chart for the past month? What's its chart for the past year? Well, that doesn't mean that every website has to code how that would work. Those websites, what they do is they call a web service. That web service was coded once. That web service then would return the data out of the database for the Apple stock, okay, in a JSON format, and then update that web page using Ajax, right, which is a partial page refresh. Okay, do you see why I didn't want to cover this entire chapter? There's a lot of new information here, and we haven't even gotten to the code yet. Okay, so again, the web browser initiates an Ajax request using what's called Fetch API. This Fetch API is going to work with a web service. That web service is part of an API, right? That API might be a C#, it might be a Java library. Okay, it's going to work with a public method. That public method is part of a bigger library of code. Okay, that web service is a public method that can then query a database server, return information out of the database for the end user to update their page with on Ajax. Many popular websites provide API that lets you use Ajax to get data from their sites. Okay. A good example of this might be Instagram. Okay, Instagram has a lot of photos that are all public. You don't have to be logged into Instagram to see a lot of these photos. And so if you want to use a web service that's part of Instagram's API, okay, this web service can return photos to your website that you can use on your website because Instagram made that accessible. Okay, and many popular websites use Ajax to improve the way they function. Again, Google, Gmail, Yahoo Mail, Instagram, Facebook, Instacart. Basically, every website uses Ajax. So a lot of new information here. And again, we haven't even gotten into the code quite yet. Now, when we talk about data formats, well, I've already talked about that. XML is one data format. JSON is a different data format. JSON puts all of the data, and we've worked with JSON objects. Puts all the information inside of curly braces. And so it might be first name, Evan, comma, middle name, So this is a JSON object that's equivalent to this is a JSON object that's equivalent to this XML. Notice it transports the same information. The information is my first name, my middle name, and Rankin's street address. So the information that we got out of the database is just the same. It's just being transported in different ways. And what I mean by transported is transported from the server down to the client. So the data formats are really XML data. Here's a little bit more of an example of XML. By the way, XML stands for Extensible Markup Language. And you can notice this looks very much like HTML with the tags and everything. And here's JSON data. Now it's a little bit, but basically you could see what I have highlighted here. All the information. So here we've got a team member, and inside of each team member has three child tags for the name, the title, and the bio. And so here we just have inside of the outer object, if you will, we have team members, and then each team member is in its own set of curly braces. So this team member equates to this one in XML, and this second team member equates to this in XML. Does it replace? No. Okay, that's a good question. Does it replace what we do in HTML? HTML is used to display the information. Okay. Right now, in our HTML course, a lot of what we had is we just put the information statically in the HTML. But a lot of times we don't have all the information for a static page. For example, Amazon, when you search for a basketball on Amazon, that information is going to come from Amazon's servers, and then it's going to transport that information in a JSON object, and then you're going to use HTML. You're going to use HTML to display it. So they have different purposes. HTML is to display information. JSON is to transport it from the server to the client. So then you still put your JSON information in the HTML. You still put the information that was in the XML document. Let me get this over here. So that's a good question. Yeah, because I would kind of look at this XML and do the same thing. Well, like, that just kind of looks like we used to just put the text right in the HTML. We used to put our content right in the HTML. Remember, HTML is for displaying content, so it made sense to put the content right in the HTML. But we don't always have the information statically available. Sometimes we have to get the information out of a database dynamically. And so it's kind of a different animal there. Why this last bullet down here says JSON is less verbose than XML. That means it's not as heavy on the processing power. So it uses less memory when being sent from the server to the client. That's why XML is kind of the old technology, because when looking at this, there's more bloat, there's more code bloat in the XML. All of this stuff here describes the data. The data is what's important. And so this JSON, it takes less bloat. You can transport the information with more efficiency using JSON. So JSON is more efficient than XML because it takes less code like here's all these tags, that this doesn't have any tags down here. It just has JSON objects, and these JSON objects are pretty simple. They have property, value inside of quotes. Property inside of quotes, value inside of quotes. Actually, they're called keys. Key and value pairs. Okay, where we left off was on what's referred to as the Json Placeholder Api. And so, to say that Facebook has an API, Twitter has an API, Instagram has an API, and what that means is that's the code that you can work with to get data back from those websites. There's a placeholder API, and this placeholder API is really just fake and dummy data. Okay, it's just a lot of lorem ipsum. Okay, but it's available for us to use as practice, and just as a demonstration. So we're going to work with a web service, which is again a public method. And the way that we work with this web service is through its URL. So here's the URL right here for this placeholder API's web service. And so we can copy this URL. And what's going to happen is when we go to this URL, it's going to call a web service and return some sort of information. And so I can paste this URL, and you can see what's actually returned here is some JSON. So the ID of 1, so the key is in quotes, but then the value, since it's a number, is not in quotes. Key, value, all the way down. We got this longitude and latitude. So this geo key that has multiple pieces as part of it. So it has its own object here. And then that's nested within an address object, and then we just continue on with the user object. Phone, website, company. This is all just dummy data. Again, the company has multiple pieces, and then this curly brace closes that curly brace. And as you might guess, if you just change the value here, we get different dummy data back. So different users. Okay, so now you can kind of see actually what a web service does. A web service is a method that's available through a URL, and it returns data. It returns data to our browser to be displayed. Now what we need to do is then we would write JavaScript that can then take this information and put that into the HTML, into the DOM. And the JavaScript that we write, that was what that was referring to earlier as the fetch API. The fetch API is the JavaScript that we write that takes the data and is going to ultimately put it into our HTML. Now there are different, there's more information on this JSON Placeholder.com, Then user information, there's posts, there's comments, there's albums, there's photos. So maybe I'll try. So I'll try /photos/4. And it gives us a URL of a photo that's at placeholder.com. We could then take this image source and put it inside of an image tag, and it would display this placeholder image. Right? So this URL we could put inside of an image source attribute to actually display. We could put the title inside of a H6 or inside of a span or inside of whatever. This album ID and this ID, a lot of times IDs you don't display to the end user because that's just like an ID for the database. It's not really needed by the end user. But you could see, like I said, there's more than just user information here. When we get into databases, we can see that databases have a bunch of tables, not just single tables like Excel tables, but they're different than Excel tables. But you could think of an Excel table of storing information, but not a database isn't like one big spreadsheet. It's like maybe 15 or 100 spreadsheets that are all somehow linked together. If we just go to /photos, you notice if we don't put in another slash, we get all of, look at all this, look at this scroll bar. So oftentimes when you're working with databases, you're not working with a little bit of information. You know, this is some 4,300 photos, 5,000 photos. Now these are all just dummy data, but there's 5,000 pieces of dummy data in regards to just the photos. Okay. Now keep in mind that when you're working with Ajax, you can work with XML, which is this XML HTTP request object. To keep this chapter kind of focused on the newer technology, we're not going to work with this XML HTTP request object. We're just going to work with the fetch API. Since this is newer, than the older XML HTTP request. Let's see. It says for new development, it is generally considered a best practice to use the fetch API, not the older XML HTTP request. And this is a little bit of the JavaScript that we're going to wind up writing. You'll notice what we did is you just take that URL and you put it inside of a method called fetch. And then you call this .then method and tell it to format that response as JSON. And here what they do is they actually log each object that's returned into the console. And so instead of just displaying this information in the browser like we did here, they fetch the information, they make sure it's in JSON, and then they log it. Okay, now ultimately, instead of logging it to the console, what we'll wind up doing is we'll update the DOM and update our web page. Okay, now going back to this page here, there's a little bit of theory that isn't summarized here. That's kind of important, and I don't necessarily want to just read to you, but I'll try and pick out the important pieces here. Okay, again, the fetch method accepts a URL, and so that's what we saw here. The fetch method takes a URL, and what's behind this URL is a web service that returns information. And what comes back from that URL is a GET request. Okay, a GET request, that's the kind of request that we are making. It's a get information. Okay, there are other kinds of requests. Like if you think of data inside of a database, there's more than you can do than just reading information. Reading information is considered a GET request. Okay, but maybe you want to update user information. Maybe you want to delete information. Maybe you want to insert new information. So there's different kinds of requests that you can issue besides a GET. Often those are called CRUD operations. CRUD operations are when you're working with a database. CRUD, C-R-U-D, create, read, update, and delete. And those are the big operations that you can do on a database. Some of the kind of the theory that you have to realize when you're working with this fetch API, when you call a GET request, what's returned is called a promise object. A promise object which represents the eventual return value. So it represents the return data you can think of from the asynchronous request. So a promise is like, I'm going to return some information, but it's called a promise because it's not, the information isn't there yet. Because it's not there because you could have errors. And so that kind of goes into this. A promise has states. It's like a promise is like a web server saying, I'm going to return something to you. And that's this promise. I'm going to return something to you. So a promise comes in 3 states. When a promise is first created, it's pending. So it's a pending promise. When the data is actually returned, it's called fulfilled. But if there's an error, it's called rejected. So those are the 3 states of your promises. Pending, like the information is on its way. If the information is received, the promise is known as fulfilled. If there's an error, the promise is known as rejected. Then there's 2 more terms working with promise. So again, those are the 3 states: pending, fulfilled, and rejected. Then there's 2 more terms. The first term, a promise that's no longer pending, is considered settled. This is true whether the promise is fulfilled or rejected. So if the status is fulfilled or rejected, either way, it's considered settled, which simply means no longer pending. Second, a promise can be resolved without being fulfilled. So what we're doing is we're kind of getting into the weeds with these promises. Again, the fetch API, when you say give me some data, it returns a promise, and that promise has some states: pending, fulfilled, and rejected. But it can also be settled, which settled is either fulfilled or rejected, or resolved. A promise can be resolved without being fulfilled. For example, if a promise returns another promise, the original promise is resolved, although the data isn't quite there yet, and the promise is isn't fulfilled. Okay, so this is where it gets a little in the weeds here. a promise could return another promise. The original one is resolved even though the requested data isn't returned yet. And so it's not fulfilled. So again, I don't know that we're going to get into this more advanced scenario, but something to keep in mind. Okay, then it says the tables in this figure present the methods that you can make an Ajax request with the fetch API. So these methods, so again, the fetch returns a promise, and once you have a promise object, you can work with the then, which runs code once you receive the promise object. It says registers the callback function to execute when the promise is resolved. So remember, resolved, if we go back one slide, you can see here the promise is resolved without being fulfilled. So anyways, when a promise is resolved, it runs this callback function inside of the then. And, you know, I think it just helps to look at this code. You call the fetch, you pass the URL that gives you back some data. We then take the data and get it into a JSON format. And then here, after that, we log it to the console. So it's really not too hard, but I think all these statuses are kind of happening in the background of the code that you have to write. Of these methods, the then method is the most difficult to understand because it accepts a callback function that executes when the promise is resolved. And you kind of saw myself working through that. The parameters that's passed to this callback function is eventually return the value of the promise. The catch method works similarly, but it executes when a promise is rejected. So it's pretty common in coding that inside of a catch is where you put the error block. And the error block is to say the promise is rejected. You get an error. Remember, rejected is this state up here. If an error occurs during the request, the promise is rejected. So basically, if you get the data back, you run the then block. If you don't get the error, or if you don't get the data back, you run the catch method. And in this case, they print the error message to the console. Let's make sure that we covered all that. Again, it gets a little bit dicey here when we start realizing, okay, we've got this thing called the promise, and this promise has, what, 3 states, but then there's also a couple things, a couple terms that are, you know, I don't know, they don't call these states. So they just say these are additional terms, settled and resolved. The first then method accepts a callback that executes when a promise is resolved. The callback accepts a response object and calls its JSON method, which returns a promise that resolves to JavaScript object that's created. So again, that's what this does. Is it says take the data in this response and put it into a JavaScript object notation. I mean, that's the format that it's in. But now we can work with it. And after that, take the JSON object and log it. So this is actually a pretty cool application, and what I'm going to do to kind of finish this out is I'm going to code this along with you guys, the astronomy picture of the day application. And so we actually make something that's useful here. We can read here, the astronomy picture of the day application displays an image or video for any date between June 16th, 1995 and today. In addition, it displays some related data such as title, date, copyright, explanation. To make this possible, the astronomy picture of the day application gets its data from the API that's available from NASA's web service. And so NASA has a web service. That web service is something that we're going to use to, again, it basically returns information like a photo or a video and some information about that photo or video. And so you can kind of see here what the application is that we create is you plug in a date, you click view, and it's going to update the web page for us. Okay, this ties all this in together. The astronomy picture of the day application allows the user to enter a date and click the view button. Then it displays an image or a video for the date. In addition, it displays some related data. Let's see. This comes from NASA's web service. When it loads, the application just says enter date with a text box. So none of this is there until you click on the view button. Okay, we start with the HTML and CSS. The API is available through this URL here. Now, I believe when I went here the other day, the first thing, if you are actually going to do this, coding outside of the textbook, you would need to generate an API key. Okay, now this step has already been done for us, but you need to, this is pretty common, you need to sign up for an API key to access and use web services available on the developer network. So keep that in mind, that as you do these in the future, you pretty much have to register to do this. Now, this was already done more than likely by Muroc. And so let's plug in. So this is where you kind of read about and learn about the NASA API. Yeah, this URL, the URL for the picture of the day, here, if I put in more information, this one works down here. For example, we need to give it a date. So that's July 22nd, 2020. And here's the data that's returned for the NASA picture of the day. And if I kind of browse down into this, you can find ultimately the picture right here. And that's the NASA picture of the day from July 22nd of this year. Okay, now what we need to do is we need to read this information and get it into a web page that we code using this Ajax and JavaScript fetch API. Okay, that's what this exercise is. Let's see. I'm going to code this. Let's see if I can. my comments there. You guys can feel free to code along if you like, but it might be a little bit challenging, being that I'm moving pretty fast. So the div ID of display, I'm sure that's going to be where we take the information and we put it inside. So pretty simple so far. We just got a couple controls. We have a div ID of display. And then we're going to link to jQuery. Nine times out of 10, I'm copying and pasting that URL, but I think I can type accurately enough. And we're going to have a little local script called APOD that we're going to link to, and that's the end of the HTML. And a little bit of CSS. We'll do embedded. Make it a little bit prettier. Okay. Pretty simple HTML, pretty simple CSS. And now we get to write the JavaScript, and which is not nearly as simple. So I need to make a file called apod.js. First thing we do is we make a method that basically the user can probably, they can put a date in various formats. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a method that formats the date in a certain format. The year first, followed by the month, followed by the day. Now, one thing that we haven't covered is this syntax here. Essentially what we're doing here is we're making a function called getDateString. So this is our function. And that function has one parameter. And that function is going to return If you remember the get full year method of our dates, that's a curly brace. Date get full year, followed by a hyphen, followed by date dot get month, and then you add 1 because it starts with 0, so get month of January would be a month of 0, so this would return January as a 1, and so on and so forth. Curly brace, quote, semicolon. So I'm going to make this full screen just so you can see what I typed. I made a method called getDateString, and what that does is it takes in a string date and it returns that date in this format: get full year, followed by a hyphen, followed by get month, and you add 1 to it. That way January isn't 0, January is 1, followed by a hyphen, followed by get date. So get date string function. Okay. Display picture function. It also takes in one parameter. So we're definitely getting into some new territory. It's code that we haven't written before. If there's an error, so if you have an error message, we load up our HTML with a span that contains the error message in it, and we'll return the HTML at the end. Otherwise, if there's code, this is also an error message. So in this case, this is an error. Display the message. This case is also, this is a problem. Display the message. So these are both error conditions. The first two are error conditions. Okay. So a switch is kind of like a if, else if statement. Basically it says if it's an image, do something. Otherwise, if it's a video, I gotta put that in quotes. If it's an image, do this. Otherwise, if it's a video, do something else. If it's neither, do the default. So in case if the media that's returned is an image, we're going to add in an image tag. With a width of 700. Alright, if it's a video, we're going to put that in an iframe. Obviously, I would need an image in my local images folder for that to display. Right. Don't forget my ending here. My ending there. make sure everything's lining up. Okay, that's the end of that function. We're still inside of the function, so now we're going to do the date and copyright. So we're still inside of our function for display picture. If the data has copyright, add it in a span, class of right, and close the div. We'll put the explanation in a paragraph. Gotta line up my curly braces because there's one more. Let's see. That's what I did. This curly brace right here on line 32 needs to go after the explanation. There we go. That's the end of this else. Now finally we display the HTML. This is where we update the DOM, right? So we're going to use jQuery to target the display, and you use jQuery's HTML function to pass the HTML variable that we've been building. So again, we're selecting the display in our HTML, which is this right here. Ooh, I got a typo. Thank you. Explanation. Thank you. So this else block covers all of this. These are error conditions. You might notice that we're using this inside of strings to get access to our variables. We put them inside of these curlies with a $sign in front of it. So this is kind of a shorthand notation. What we were doing with string concatenation, we would do something like this. Okay, so let me explain this part. So before we would do something like this. We would do, h3 plus variable plus closing h3. Okay, we were doing string concatenation before, and there's a different syntax which is a little bit more shorthand, which we haven't covered, which is using the $sign and then accessing your variables directly. Data is the input to the function, so the data will be passed to this function whenever you call it, and then the title is a property that belongs to the data. So data.url, data.title, data.date. This is all coming from that JSON object that's passed into this method whenever we call it. Okay, so I did talk about some new things that we haven't covered, and that's probably the biggest thing right here. Maybe I should have explained this before I coded this, but before we were using concatenation like this. This is a pain in the butt. This is much easier. Okay, so this is a way to stay inside of our string and get access to a variable and the values that are in the variable without concatenating everything together. So we did that quite a bit. All right, the next thing that we have here is a method for errors. Okay, it would be a small miracle if I didn't have any typos in here. I do expect an error somewhere. It's bound to happen. Okay, so really what we did here is we made a bunch of different functions to call. Really, inside of our JavaScript here, we made 1, 2, 3 functions. So these are just JavaScript functions that we will call and use. This is another way of writing document.ready. Let's see here. So now we're in a little bit of jQuery. Okay, some normal JavaScript that we've done. So here we call this function getDateString that we coded earlier. And basically get today's date, and we're storing today's date in date_str. And so it'll be in this format, this inside of this variable. So we make a variable called date text box, and then we select the ID of date. So the ID of date is this label. No, the ID of date, I'm sorry. The ID of date here is this text box. So we store this text box inside of a JavaScript variable. So this is an entire text box. And then we're going to date text box dot val so we write today's date in there, and then we focus it. Wire up an event handler for the view button. Click. Again, it's just a different syntax for our click event. This is known as a lambda expression. For the most part, we're not going to go into it right now. But basically, what goes on inside of here is our click event. It's just a different syntax. Just think of it as a different syntax, and that's all. Get date from text box. And we have to re-get the date, because you'll notice here we set a date, but we set today's date in the text box whenever the page loads. So, obviously we're going to let the user change the date, and so we need to reread that in case they changed it. Create a date variable using the variable that's coming from the text box. So basically creating a date variable called date obj, date object. All right, got an error message. It's an invalid date format. We call our method, pass our date object into it, make sure it's in the proper format. Again, year, month, day, day. So our date string will be in that format. All right. Now we get to build the URL for API request. So we got our domain. This is the part where we did not have to create an API key because they already made a demo key and they just called it demo key. Whereas if we were doing this from scratch, we would have to register and get a key. Make these single quotes just because that's been what I've been doing. So again, kind of back here a little bit. Remember what I showed down here was to get the data, we needed the URL plus the API key plus a date in this format. And that actually gave us in return the data that we were looking for. And so when we look at the JavaScript that we just wrote, that's what we have. We have the URL, we have the API key, plus we have a date that we read that the user provided. And now we get to run that fetch method. And again, this is built into JavaScript, so this is not part of jQuery. This is built into JavaScript. So we fetch, then we take the response object and get it into jQuery, JSON, jQuery. Then we take that JSON and call our display picture method, passing it the data that's stored in our JSON object. However, if we have an error, we call the catch method and pass that error to the display error method that we wrote. The data being E. Okay, that's the end of our else block. And then we can refocus the date. Using some jQuery. Then that's the end of our click event. And that's the end of ready. And click and ready. Drum roll. What's that movie with the Griswolds, and he sets up all the lights outside, and he brings his whole family outside, and he says drum roll, and they plugs it in and it doesn't work? That's gonna happen right here. Just as a heads up. See, already, so you can kind of see that already doesn't clearly work. So it populated the text box, National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. Yeah. So already found my first mistake. Let's go into Let's go into where we wrote that. So we called getDateString. Let me go back to my getDateString. Make sure I don't have a typo in that. Ah. No parentheses around that. That's interesting. I did that 3 times. All right, still not working. So let's just, it gets the year 2020, and then it gets the month 12, and then it gets, so we'll do 2020, then the month we'll say 11, and then 10. All right, good. I'm gonna pause the recording. I'll do a little troubleshooting here. Okay, and as I am back from the recording live now, I'll point out my mistake, and that mistake was everywhere that I use this notation instead of the concatenation, I had single quotes instead of this character here, which is the Graves character, and that character is on the key with the tilde. And so when you use this syntax, it was just something that I forgot and I had to figure out. Anyways, that got us to this point. So now instead of having a literal string when we load the page, we get today's date. Not that that's fixed all the errors, but let's just take a look. And there we get the no API key was supplied. So we're getting an error message. Get one at api.nasa.gov. That tells me that there's something wrong with this API. Oh, there it is. API equals key. That's going to be that's a typo. Let me fix that. It's API underscore key equals demo underscore key and date equal to, oh, let's put single. Let's put, good thing we looked at this. There we go. So anywhere we had the $sign, I replace it with that character. All right, let's launch the page. I don't know if they would post one for today yet, so I'm going to go to yesterday. Hey, there we go. I love it. And our demonstration is working. Let's bring it back to the textbook. All right, we are going to stop our first lecture here. on Ajax.